Looks like Sneako is about to have a really bad weeko. If you have no idea who Sneako is, welcome to the club. Why am I talking about him? Because this gamer, streamer, whatever, just became the new poster boy for Islam. Much like his hero Andrew Tate, Sneako knows absolutely nothing about Christianity or Islam. But also, like Andrew Tate, Sneako's complete ignorance about Christianity and Islam doesn't stop him from constantly talking about Christianity and Islam. On the contrary, his ignorance made him the perfect target for dawah. A dawah-gandist looks at Sneako the same way Andrew Tate looks at a beautiful girl on Instagram. Oh look, here's someone I can manipulate into joining my sex cult and helping me get more followers. In case you're new to dawah, dawah is what jihadis do when they're too weak to fight. When they're not in a position to violently subjugate people, they lie to people in order to keep them in a state of ignorance until the jihadi community is strong enough to fight. Sneako has been a Muslim for all of 5 minutes, and he's already spouting the standard dawah lies, which means that someone is feeding him this nonsense and that we have a new opportunity to expose it. Take Sneako's claim that there's only one Quran.
You know what book has never been manipulated? You know what book has no 30 different versions of it? The Quran. Stayed consistent for 1400 years. But the original text of the Quran has never been tampered with, has never been manipulated. And this is the one that you could always go to. It's the same, it's consistent. But no, it's directly translated from the original Quran. There was no council for the Quran. My point is that the Quran hasn't been manipulated by a council. It was recited by Muhammad, peace be upon him. And then that's exactly what the Quran is. And it hasn't been tampered with. It's been consistent the whole time. I'm just giving you a reason why I believe in the Quran more, because I can be certain that this hasn't been tampered with. And there's one version of the Quran. Well, that's what they call dawah in the Quran, is trying to spread the truth. Like once you realize the truth, it's good to go and bring other people on board with the truth.
So, the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, and it's been consistent ever since. Smooth sailing. Only one version of the Quran. Now, did Sneako examine Qurans from around the world and discover that they're all identical? Of course he didn't. Dawah-gandists told him that there's only one Quran, and he believed them, without bothering to investigate. So, where did Sneako hear that there's only one Quran? Well, he probably heard it from lots of Muslims, because the myth of one Quran has been spreading for a few decades now. Yes, I said for a few decades. For most of Islamic history, Muslims understood that there were different Qurans. But eventually, Muslim scholars and dawah-gandists realized that they could impress people by lying. Here's Sheikh Yasser Qadhi telling a popular audience that since the time of Caliph Uthman, no two copies of the Quran have ever differed in even a single word or letter.
So the Caliph Uthman standardized the copies of the Quran, and therefore from his time up until our time there has never been two copies of the Quran that are different even in one letter or one word.
Perfect preservation right down to the letter. Welcome to Fantasyland, population 1.8 billion. You just heard Sheikh Yasser Qadhi in a video made for people like Sneako, people who don't know anything about the history of the Quran, say that every copy of the Quran in the world today is completely identical to every other copy. You heard him say that, right?
From his time up until our time, there has never been two copies of the Quran that are different even in one letter or one word.
But now I'm confused, because Sheikh Yasser Qadhi definitely does not believe what he just said. How do I know that he doesn't believe what he just said? Because when he's speaking to people he calls students of knowledge, these are Muslims who are on the path to becoming scholars, he admits that there are different Qurans.
In other words, if you were to compare two printed Qurans, you're going to see differences between them.
But world-renowned Quran scholar Sneako says you're wrong, Sheikh.
And this is something that many people are unaware of and many people have heard but are not fully familiar with, especially those who have been exposed to some of our brothers who live in Algeria or Morocco or other North African countries. They recite the Quran in a slightly different way.
They recite the Quran differently? Are you simply referring to a different voice or speaking style?
Not just a voice or not just a speaking style, but also changes in letters and words and harakat.
Different letters and words? Here I thought that no two copies of the Quran differed in even a single letter or word. Where did I get that idea?
From his time up until our time, there has never been two copies of the Quran that are different even in one letter or one word.
Oh, that's just what Sheikh Yasser Qadhi says to people like Sneako. What does he say to students of knowledge again?
In other words, if you were to compare two printed Qur'ans, you're going to see differences between them. Changes in letters and words and harakat.
If you'd like to perform a fun experiment, line up 1,000 fans of Sheikh Yasser Qadhi. Show them clips of him saying that the Quran has been perfectly preserved right down to the letter. Then show them clips of him admitting that there are different Qurans in different parts of the world. Then ask if they have any problem whatsoever with Sheikh Yasser Qadhi saying completely different things to different audiences. They won't have any problem with this at all, because Dawagandists don't simply lie to their listeners. They also psychologically condition their listeners to think that it's okay to lie for Dawah. Fascinating religion. But Sheikh Yasser Qadhi isn't the only Muslim scholar who admits that there are different Qurans in different parts of the world. Here's Dr. Shabir Ali.
Today, most Muslims read the Quran in a text that is referred to as the Egyptian edition of 1924.
Most Muslims read a particular Egyptian version from 1924? I thought all Muslims of all times read exactly the same Quran.
But this is not the only text of the Quran that is read throughout the world.
Wait, there are different versions of the Quran even today? That's not what Sneako says.
In North Africa, there is a slightly different text that is based on a slightly different reading, mostly corresponding to what we read in the rest of the world.
A different text?
There is a slightly different text
that mostly corresponds to what other Muslims read?
Mostly corresponding to what we read in the rest of the world.
This isn't what Sneako's been saying at all.
And then, too, in some parts of Africa, there is another reading of the Quran and a matching manuscript that is prevalent. And here, too, we find some slight variations.
Still another version in other parts of Africa? With more variations?
And here, too, we find some slight variations.
Keep in mind, these are different Qurans that are still used in different parts of the world today. When we go to early manuscripts of the Quran, the problem becomes even more glaring. For instance, after describing the Sana'a manuscript, which contains tons of variants, Shabir says this.
This cuts away at the sense of complacency that many Muslims have gone around with, thinking that, okay, everything has been preserved dot for dot, letter for letter, the way it was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with no variation or change whatsoever.
So, the Sana'a manuscript refutes the absurd claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved.
That it cuts at that general sense, which actually is not a scholarly way of thinking about the Quran. Our scholars have always known and have always described in our classical books variations and manuscripts.
Notice, Muslim scholars have always known about different versions of the Quran.
Like, it's read like this by Ubay bin Ka'b, it's read like this by Ibn Masud and so on. And in the Codex of Ibn Masud, it was seen to be written like this. In the Codex of Ubay bin Ka'b, it was seen to be written like this with this or that variation. So,
for a book that supposedly has no variants, that sounds like a lot of variants.
These were always known in scholarly circles to have existed. But recently, average Muslims have just simply, without bothering to learn, they have just simply parroted a common way of speaking about the Quran and saying, it's 100% the way it's always been, and they cannot imagine any variation.
Average Muslims, without bothering to study, keep parroting the claim of perfect preservation.
Without bothering to learn, they have just simply parroted a common way of speaking about the Quran and saying, it's 100% the way it's always been.
But where did they get the idea that they keep parroting?
There has never been two copies of the Quran that are different even in one letter or one word.
From their scholars, the same scholars who have always known about textual variants and different versions of the Quran.
Our scholars have always known and have always described in our classical books variations and manuscripts. These were always known in scholarly circles to have existed.
Quick question for you Muslims who are watching. What would it take for you to realize that your scholars are liars who say one thing when they're talking to other scholars and say something completely different to you? Your scholars know about the different versions of the Quran among Muhammad's companions. They know about different Qurans in different parts of the world today. They know about textual variants, but they tell you perfect preservation right down to the letter. They're lying, right? I mean, obviously. They're obviously lying. Another quick question. Why doesn't it bother you at all when your scholars lie to you? If I caught a Christian scholar blatantly lying, I don't mean getting something wrong or making a mistake. I mean lying. I would have a really, really big problem with that Christian scholar. So would other Christians. We wouldn't trust him anymore. We wouldn't take it. But in Islam, lying seems to be an ordinary part of being a scholar. And scholars who lie face no consequences whatsoever from their students, and this encourages more lying. Does the true religion need that? Does the true religion need scholars to lie for it? You'll recall Shabir saying that Muslims parrot the claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved without bothering to study.
But recently, average Muslims have just simply, without bothering to learn, they have just simply parroted a common way of speaking about the Quran and saying, it's 100% the way it's always been.
What would happen if, instead of mindlessly repeating the lie about perfect preservation, Muslims instead did a little research? If Muslims bothered to do a little research, they would find that, according to Muslim sources, entire chapters of the Quran were lost because Muhammad's companions were too lazy to recite them. They would find that hundreds of verses were lost from other chapters because the only Muslims who had them memorized died in battle, or because the only copy was eaten by a sheep. They would find that Muhammad's top reciters of the Quran couldn't even agree on which chapters were supposed to be in the Quran. Muhammad's companion Ibn Masud said that there are supposed to be 111 chapters in the Quran. Muhammad's companion Ubay ibn Ka'b said that there are supposed to be 116 chapters in the Quran. The Quran today has 114 chapters. Muslims who do some basic research would find that Uthman, the third of the rightly guided caliphs, had to burn piles of Qurans to cover up all the differences. And they would find that even now, different manuscripts of the Quran are filled with textual variants, and that Muslims in different parts of the world use different Qurans. But the average Muslim doesn't know any of this because he only listens to lying scholars and dawagandists, people who think that lying is perfectly acceptable as long as the lying helps win more converts. So, our friend Sneako bought the lies.
You know what book has never been manipulated? You know what book has no 30 different versions of it? The Quran. Stayed consistent for 1400 years. But the original text of the Quran has never been tampered with, has never been manipulated.
The only question is whether the lying will bother him at all once it's been exposed. Even as you're watching this, dawagandists are conditioning Sneako to only believe what they say. In a sane world, Sneako would hear a Muslim scholar claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. Then Sneako would do a few minutes of research, which is really all it takes to debunk the myth of perfect preservation. Then Sneako would say to himself, "You know, Sneakster, if they lied to you about this, What else did they lie to you about? And once he figured out that he can't trust these guys, he would only believe claims that are actually based on evidence. He would leave Islam, and he would be the latest apostate receiving public death threats from the likes of Ali Dawah.
This is a part of our religion. There's a reason to it. Yeah? There's a reason why there's a capital punishment. Because people like you, little weaklings, who leave their religion and cause corruption in the land by spreading it, the capital punishment in Islamic law would be applied to you. We have no doubt, and we're proud of that.
Now, I'd be happy to go into a lot more detail on the history of the Quran. We can go through passages in Islam's most trusted sources that describe in vivid detail what an incredibly sloppy and flawed process the collection of the Quran was. We can put different versions of the Quran from today side by side, and we can see the variance. We can show all of this to Sneako and ask him how he can possibly trust the Dawagandists who are lying to him. Let me know what you'd like to see. But keep in mind, I only responded to one of Sneako's claims. He loves talking about Christianity and Islam, but he gets pretty much everything wrong whenever he talks about Christianity and Islam, so it looks like he's going to give us an endless supply of material. Fortunately, my friend John McCrae, aka Whaddo You Meme, has made a video going through some of Sneako's other claims. Be sure to watch John's video to see how much our new friend Sneako really knows about the religion he just converted to.
You're proud of that. You're proud of that. You're proud of that. It just backfired on you. You're proud of that. You're proud of that. You're proud of that. It just backfired on you. This is a part of our religion. There's a reason to it. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah?